I'm going to talk about the convergence of crisis and just transition and the requirement for us to deal with recovery and resilience in that frame. And John will talk more specifically about wage-led growth. We'll all remember John's leadership of ITUC, and indeed he was my partner coming out of the 2008-9 crisis when I took over this job at the end of 2010. And so I feel very comforted having him back in our kind of advisory sphere. So you know as well as I do that the world's facing a convergence of crises. We already had massive inequality. We have the climate emergency. Progress for women had stalled. And now we have COVID-19 and the devastating impact on lives, the health crisis that is associated with it, and indeed the economic risks and jobs. So we have to deal with all of this, and inclusive of the risks and, well, the threats and the opportunities from technology, because we have both good and bad tech issues to deal with. So all of that requires the framing of just transition. But I wanted to, and I want to say to you, of course, the world has to change. We were already talking about changing the rules. As you'll recall, that was the theme of our Congress. We must change the rules. We must build workers' power to change the rules. But indeed, now we're kind of putting that in a language that says we don't want to just build back. We want to actually redesign a future that deals with all of those issues of crisis which impact on our members and their families. For Iceland, as John will reflect, I'm sure, unions were at the helm of the 2008-9 crisis, and you designed your own future. You absolutely did. You still remain a case study with major changes in your economy and the security of employment, and you defied the world when they would have told you to take a different austerity process. I was indeed with you last year when you concluded, I think it was last year, Dreefa, the last agreement for the private sector, which was a massive act of solidarity to raise the wages of the low paid. And I've watched your fight in the private sector, and I've watched your fight for low paid workers in the public sector. Equally, I witnessed your support for women's rights and economic participation at the Nordic Prime Minister's President's meeting, the Nordic Leaders meeting last year. Plus, you've just been one of our most constant supporters for the sense of dealing with the climate crisis and therefore climate action and just transition, because sadly it's an imperative we can't avoid. Yet none of this is easy to navigate. And as I said, technological shifts will pose both threats and opportunities. If we consider the climate crisis is vital to stabilise the planet for human existence, then I just want to remind us all that we have to achieve a net zero outcome by 2050 and 40% of that effort by 2030 to have a fighting chance. This means every sector must shift, and it will only happen if unions are engaged, if unions are at the design table. Now, Iceland, of course, has a small population, but per head, you have amongst the highest emissions in the EU. In fact, in 2016, it was the highest. And that's despite your advantage of geothermal energy. So, you know, when you look at some of the issues vital to your economy, aviation and tourism, shipping, and domestic production of basic minerals, that's what's in combination the risk for Iceland. And indeed, we know that all of these sectors can transition. And now's the time to think about that in terms of investment, because we want to see an investment-led recovery that gives us the resilience that is necessary to deal with whatever the future throws at us. But we know, for example, in aviation, despite the reluctance of the fossil fuel companies, right now you could knock a third of emissions off if they would just readjust their production to cleaner fuel. It's proven. It's simply a price captivity by them. that the price capture by them that doesn't want to shift their profit base. So that's an area. A third could come from that. A third from indeed greater efficiency, because with some technologies like 3D printing, you can now manufacture parts of, and not just 3D printing, but you can manufacture parts of the aeroplane that are so much lighter. And that, of course, means less fuel. And we can also retrofit planes. So it's not just new planes, we can actually retrofit planes, more jobs, more production, and so on. And then the third is nature-based solutions. Indeed, it is about offsets, but it's also about what are the ecosystem support. And you have a lot of ecotourism and other areas where we can play out that kind of third. Now, it's not perfect, that third, but it will actually help us to get in that sector to net zero, or at least 40% by 2030, which is our target now, much more quickly. I would say you've also attracted manufacturing, aluminium, I think, and some other sectors. And with your geothermal energy base, you're a head start anyway, because the big emissions are in fossil fuel-based energy. But there's also technology now, which we've seen trialled in Sweden and other places, which we can get to scale indeed in Sweden in steel, and in India, believe it or not, in cement, where we're not just talking about reducing emissions, but in the case of the Indian company Damia, they're actually putting together a circular production frame. So they're talking about capturing their carbon and their heat, and in fact they're proving that they can in fact produce other products like organic fertilizers or soda ash, but they're also looking at carbon rods, which would in fact be as strong as steel. So there's opportunities for us. We need to be abreast of what works in your economy and support you through this mix. I could tell you about a lot of other sectors, but time beats me. So I want to just go to what are the challenges for unions where these changes affect jobs or they require deployment of additional skills. Then we need to ensure that just transition measures are in line with our union principles. That requires you at the table. You have an advantage of social dialogue, which makes this possible. Of course, we need to secure pensions for older workers. Of course, we need to look at skills and redeployment for younger workers, and maybe go back to working time capacity. That's on the table. The whole of the European Union is looking at supporting companies through the SURE program to actually support part-time working arrangements, but with a maximum of 80% of salary. Now, where that's picked up and becomes part of the design base of the future, that's a good thing, because we do need to share work more equitably if we're to go back to an old principle of full employment. And then we need to respect, of course, collective bargaining, prevailing wage rates in industry sectors, and to ensure decent work. And finally, we need to invest in jobs and community renewal, because we can't stand by and see whole communities devastated. We have to find what it is that will actually give us community base. And if we've learned anything from this crisis, we've got to revisit investment in the healthcare sector and other areas of care, education, aged care, childcare. There are many jobs here, and they're jobs that we can mix with work and family as well. So I know your strengths and have no doubt, as we redesign a future that is both accountable for it, that accounts for recovery, but is also building a resilience, that we will learn from your deliberations and what you put in place. Can I just say, on the broader front, this crisis has exposed the failings of the current economic model and the tragedy of inequality. We are actually fighting to protect non-essential supply chains, which are at risk of collapse, just collapse. Now, many of you who know me know I've led a fight against the dehumanizing exploitations of those very supply chains. But right now, the real fear of not just a loss of livelihoods, but without global social protection floors that the world promised, SDG 1 and health, of course, 3, then we could face not just 200 million jobs lost or equivalent hours, but up to 250 million people at risk in the short term of starvation. So we are one world, and in our quest for a new social contract, we simply have to put people and the planet first. I'll leave you with the story of Jamila, a young woman from Somalia, and you'll understand why we're fighting today with the Labour ministers in the G20. I've asked Pierre to actually pledge or to pursue a meeting of Labour ministers and finance ministers, maybe even health ministers in the OECD, because Jamila Hussein is a 26-year-old with a tea kiosk in Mogadishu. She says people are no longer coming to our kiosk to buy tea or coffee since the coronavirus started. I am the breadwinner for my family of 9, father, mother, and 7 siblings, feeding them from what I earn after selling tea or coffee. Nevertheless, I cook the tea every morning, but no one comes to my kiosk. I talk to this woman, so she makes me a bit emotional. Yesterday, I did not earn even 1 shilling. I went home empty-handed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Always putting the small and the big perspectives in focus. Thank you so much for your talk. We will go right ahead to John now and leave Q&A for later. John, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll just put up some talking points, which hopefully will work. Yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation. I just would build on a little bit of what Sharon said, to think what are the choices and what are the options in the months ahead for the sort of models on wages and investment, which we should be thinking about in the global trade union movement, and put that in a bit in the context of what happened in 2008, 2009, which of course is very different now, the situation we're facing, and you have great experience, of also, as Sharon said, with being at the epicenter of the financial crisis. But are the lessons to learn, and what are the thoughts going ahead? I think we're now in a situation where we have to be thinking about moving from what are the emergency responses that have been in place by most countries, most industrialized countries, and many developing countries over the last 2 months, to what sort of recovery measures would be required, and what those plans should look like. That's against the background, probably at the most optimistic assessment, which the IMF had of the contraction of the global economy by 5%, over 6% in industrialized countries, less in the emerging countries. And on the assumption that in the middle of this year, the pandemic issues will ease, which will allow the lockdown to be certainly not removed, but at least eased to see a larger part of the economy back in action. But that will still leave an enormous gap between productive potential and where economies are likely to be performing in the latter half of this year. And governments in one kind or another will be looking at the sort of recovery plans. Nobody's talking about stimulus now, but they will require certain stimuluses in areas from government policy in the future, against the background of the far greater powers that governments have taken over the economies in the last 2 months, which none of us would have thought possible or politically possible even 3 months ago. So in the labour movement, I think we have to be thinking about what are the opportunities to sort of transform the growth models to one which is more socially and environmentally sustainable over the long term. Sharon set out the challenges on the climate environmental sustainability issues. And also, I would say that despite differences from the financial crisis, we have to go back and learn from the failures and successes of government policies at that time and immediately afterwards. Just very briefly to recap, I mean, from 2009 onwards, the International Labour Movement, ICFTU and ITUC and TUAC really kind of pulled together and supported the sort of recovery measures which were put in place at the London summit in 2009, subsequently in Pittsburgh. One of the key errors, looking back on it, was the pivot to austerity in 2010 with a sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And I think there's an analogy now, in some senses, that if governments were to move too quickly to ease up on some of the restrictions, we fall back into a second wave of infections, we can see an even greater economic shock down the road. It's a very different area, but I think some of the analogies between the pandemic and the financial crisis at that time are relevant. And that pivot to austerity meant that by 2014, it was clear that the global recovery had stalled, and governments went back to very much business as usual, arguing for structural reforms, liberalizing economies, continuing to recommend decentralization of collective bargaining and wage restraint. We worked with a series of economists at the University of Greenwich in the UK to put forward some alternative models and to really back up our proposals at the G20 summit in Australia in 2014. And that really had two planks. One was to try and tackle the inequality issue by reversing the decline in the wage share, which had happened in all but 3 of the G20 countries over the previous 20 years. And we estimated that by restoring the share of wages in GDP to the level it was in 1980, that would actually have an impact of raising growth by 2% over the 5 years, which at that point was the target of governments through structural reforms. And we backed that up by arguing for an increase in public investment, 1% of GDP, to really tackle some of the fundamental underlying problems. And we estimated that could have increased growth by 3.8% over those 5 years. So that would have brought the economies much faster and much more rapidly to a period of more sustained employment and high growth. Just to show, I mean, that was the decline of the wage share. The blue line with the left-hand index shows the decline of the wage share in income of the industrialized economies. The red one and the right index shows the emerging economies. So we were not that radical. We were suggesting just really trying to bring growth, the balance between profits and wages, back up to the level they'd been in 1980. I think in retrospect, the lessons now from that work was that the calculations were not dismissed by the OECD or other international organizations. I think that the multiplier assumptions in there were accepted as being reasonable. And it was really to get the message across that wages and investment both have to be key parts of the recovery policies. And it was a response really to the austerity, which had become the leitmotif of so many of the European governments in the mid-2010s. Looking forward, I think we have to show that in looking at wages and how we can rebuild wages, the structure of wages will need to be different. I think this pandemic has shown how dependent societies are on low-paid service workers. Obviously in the front line, nurses, doctors, but hospital cleaners, refuse collectors, shop workers, store workers, all in a way who are in the front line and seeing major risks of infection from the pandemic where they're still going to work. And in London, the excessively high infection rate amongst bus drivers, I think, shows the risks without proper equipment that many workers have been forced to take. So in a way, very underappreciated activities in the past, in the future, have shown they're really in the front line of this war on the pandemic. And I think those lessons can't be forgotten in looking at wage structures in the future. And so building fairness into the sort of recovery programs of how workers are treated is absolutely essential. And social dialogue and working forward on consensus will be central in that area of not going back to the past and the worst parts of business as usual. A word on investment quickly. Again, I think public investment will clearly be needed to handle a significant part of the transition that Sharan was talking about in terms of climate objectives. But also in terms of sectoral impact. I don't need to tell you how heavily dependent prior to this crisis Iceland was on tourism as a sector. Far more tourists per head of population than any other OECD country. And I think looking ahead, obviously, transport, tourism, entertainment will look very different 5 years from now. So thinking through how those sectors may look, what are the sorts of activities which can learn from the pandemic, but at the same time provide the sorts of services and in the future is crucial. Research, crucially important. Health medical research will need to expand. Clearly the need to have a possibility of some slack in the system in the future for health sectors, so that if they're hit by a pandemic, we don't get to this appalling situation of lives being lost due to overstretched resources. And finally, in all of this, investment in skills, education for the future is key. So to conclude, a few thoughts about Iceland. You obviously know it much better than I do. But one thing that does strike me, you are used to major shocks. I mean, putting it politely. I mean, 2000 finance, in a much more minor way, the 2010 volcanoes. I remember trying to get to a G20 meeting when stranded in an airport somewhere with all flights down. But dealing with major disruptions, and indeed your collapse of a low-cost airline in 2019 had a significant impact on the economy and growth in total. So I think you have the experience of dealing with some of these shocks, which in some other countries, it's still in some ways just not there. Perhaps most importantly, the strength of your social structures, highest unionization rate in the OECD, already getting your agreement in March, tripartite agreement on the pandemic, shows the importance of tripartitism. Low income inequality, previously high employment rates. And again, I think the opportunities you had, both by the situation and by rapid action in the emergency measures, not to have to go through to a straight full lockdown, because you could get high levels of testing. Driffill was just saying, 15% of the population.
Loka öllu samfélaginu, eins og mörg önnur, það sýnir líka fram á styrkleika og tækifæri sem þið hafið.
But there are challenges, which you know better than I do, but obviously what will tourism look like in the future and what will that sector have to depend? It wasn't your most dependent, you weren't not that dependent on that sector in the past, so you have transferred. I think the importance of raising investment skills and education is key. The OECD said some things in the last country report about the education system. I don't know enough about how valid some of those points were. Perhaps raising some of the questions about the capacity of education skills is important in the future. Investment in research, cooperation between the public and the private sector, which obviously looks key. I'm sitting talking to people here in France, and the government is on a day-to-day basis discussing what will the capacity be in research, making sure that companies are not bought up in the short term by American investors and losing the intellectual property, but ensuring there is a capacity in the future for research is key. And as Sharan was saying, carbon emission reductions as part of the future policy. None of that's perhaps very surprising, but things to focus on. I conclude just to say that we are thinking very much about, what are the broader pictures? And I wrote an article that was published by ITUC a few days ago, in which I was saying that the lessons from the previous crisis show that countries which preserve jobs and value workers will be more resilient to future shocks. But fairness is key, both on financing and design of policies. Sharan just spoke about the real risks of developing countries and the fragility, both of the health system and the economic system in those countries, and the dangers that comes back as a second wave infection, even from a self-interested point of view in industrialized countries, something which some countries have to learn in an industrialized world. And perhaps one key lesson from 2008 and 9, support for the private sector and the financial sector has to be not unconditional. There have to be conditions, and we have to make sure companies pay their taxes and they fit to broader social objectives in the future, and they treat their workers well, and maybe there's an opportunity for industrial democracy. I reread some of Keynes. This is just a finish, and I won't quote the whole of that quotation, but he wrote in 1940 How to Pay for the War. And he said, oops, I've just lost it. Sorry. I'm trying to get rid of the your faces, which actually block the quotation. Sorry. In what he was recommending, he basically said that it would be an opportunity that in the crisis measures to embody an advance towards economic equality greater than any which we've had in recent times. Maybe that's one lesson just to finish on as to how we live with this. It's also an opportunity, and not just a crisis that we just have to live with. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John. Very inspiring, very good. The participants who want to ask questions, please put your name in the chat box. I have actually one question for Sharan and one for you, John. Sharan, I would very much like you to go into the ideology of just transition. What does just transition entail? And if you could give us one example of successful just transition with the presence and involvement of the labor union. And for you, John, I was 2 points actually, both the structure of wages, how that could look like in the future. Of course, we are in the same thinking here that the jobs that previously were not very highly valued are now the essence of our health and life. And then I also wanted to ask you about the conditions for the private sector, because of course now we are putting a lot of money to the private sector. We have put forward conditions that there will be no massive layoffs if you get money from the state, or if you get insurance for loans from the state. And of course you don't give money to the investors, and of course you don't do social dumping. We actually have a little bit peculiar situation in Iceland, as we have massive pension funds who are investing actually in companies, so we can have influence through that. But if you could elaborate a little bit about the conditions for the private sector. But Sharan, if you could just give us the broader picture of just transition, I would be appreciated.
So the backdrop to this is, particularly in the manufacturing sector, but also in finance, services and other areas, we've seen massive transitions, but they haven't actually been just, in the sense that workers have lost jobs, of course. They've been displaced from communities have collapsed. And so, as you know, the union movement set out more than a decade ago now, up to 15 years, to say, we will never build trust and support for the transition we know is a systemic imperative that's bigger than anything we've seen around climate. So we built the narrative and a massive campaign around just transition till we got that in the Paris Agreement in 2015. However, we woke up the next day in the ITUC office, or a little longer than the next day. And I went, oh my God, we cannot achieve the transition of every part of our economy because every sector must change from this desk. So we built a Just Transition Centre, and they now work to support unions at the table all over the world. It's led by Samantha Smith, who we poached from WWF. So she has a climate background. She's very, very in tune with unions. But I'll just give you 2 examples because they're growing. well, maybe three quickly. One is, of course, the issue around exit from coal. You don't have to worry so much about any of the fossil fuel, except in aviation and maritime and so on, but in terms of your production of power. But we've seen Germany, Spain, Canada, I'm missing another one, actually have agreements about how you exit from coal. And many more are now talking about, Norway and others, how you reduce investments in fossil fuels. And of course, the investors you talked about, you don't have to listen to me, but any pension funds that invest in stranded assets like fossil fuels are either going to have a plan for exiting, or we're going to see continuation of massive, massive losses of return, which we're already seeing with the slump created by the Saudis in the oil industry today. So we know that sector was the front lines. But then if every sector has to change, the other one I talked to you about, cement, I think it's the best example, and ironically out of India, and there is a union at the table. But your own colleague Carl Petter and the Swedes can tell you what we've done with the Just Transition Centre, and now Carl himself is taking a leadership role in this to shift the economy in steel, because it actually means making the price point, being able to raise a competitive price point. So initially it will probably mean some industry policy support to the private sector. But indeed, we want to see conditions on that, as you said, Dreefa. And the final one is a small community in my own country where I worked with as an advisor, and we made a small video about this. The community is on the edge of the desert, which is a tourist, well, not now, but it's an access to tourism in the desert, and some wonderful places, but very remote. And it's a hinterland for people from the city. But it's a reasonably small community, and they knew that the coal-fired power stations would close. They had notice of that. They were 5 years in building a campaign after doing all their research for solar thermal technology, because it had the most overlapping skills for coal-fired power station workers. And indeed, they got within 7 months of getting the financing, had a company ready to go to build the solar plant. They built a demonstration one, and this is the real story, because out of that they discovered in the desert they could create new jobs, because they started growing vegetables that were then large enough to actually transport for markets in the city, in hothouses in the desert with solar thermal. So new industries, and eventually they got there with an interruption of 7 months, which was tragic for the workers, but actually the community never gave up. So solar thermal is the future there, and they've built new industries. So that just gives you a bit of a taste. There are water companies, again, not your biggest problem, although, depends where you go with desalination and so on. But there are water companies that our pension funds bought in the middle of England, where they reduced the energy by 60% by having unions at the design table around the way they work. I won't go on, Dreefa, but there are lots. Finally, can I just say to you, on the conditionality for the private sector, you've got it right. Denmark's actually now put in place a restriction on share buybacks for 2 years. No companies can access support that have their funds in tax havens, and the rest of what you said I won't repeat, but it's absolutely the right conditionality.
Thank you, Sharan. I will give the word to John now, and then we will take some questions from the audience, which I see are rolling in. John, please.
Yeah, on the wage issues, I'd say that there are perhaps three priorities looking forward. One, the gig economy had become very fashionable in some countries, and non-standard work, as it's euphemistically called sometimes, but basically with all the risk being pushed onto the individual worker. And I think the pandemic in many countries has shown that's a non-viable model socially. So I think extending the rights of gig workers and ensuring that the employment relations properly established and there's proper social safety nets for all workers in the future, I think is crucially important. I mean, related to that, obviously, we're all getting, as Sharon said earlier, slightly more sophisticated dealing with home working and new technology and different forms of work organisation. And I'd simply say that I'm still on a quite sharp learning curve, but I think maybe there are different choices to be made also voluntarily for some workers and different work patterns in the future. So I think a lot of thinking about that. Also, in terms of work organisation, I mean, what has been interesting in some areas is that things have been achieved in areas of research on trying to get forms of production together in some countries to deal with an emergency, which might take months or years in some cases. People have been putting stuff together in just a few days or weeks. So, you know, going back to some of the ideas in the Nordic countries of autonomous team working and work organisation, trying to use technology in a different way, I think there's maybe some lessons to be had there. In the public sector, I'd say obviously trying to, many countries just drive costs down through outsourcing and lowering wages and poor working conditions, particularly in ancillary staff. Again, the costs have been shown of going in that direction. So how to properly reward the cleaning staff and ancillary staff in health service and elsewhere, such a key part of the system. And more broadly, looking at the question of pay structures. I mean, obviously, Iceland has is one of the low inequality countries in the OECD, so we have things to learn from you of how you've managed to achieve that through your wage bargaining. But in many countries, inequality really rose again towards the end of the 2010s. And so I'd say those are some of the things to be thinking about. On the question of conditionality, I just mentioned 4 things. Sharon alluded to one, tax havens. You know, companies might want to pay taxes in the countries where they receive benefits from governments in the future. Maybe we ought to make that absolutely mandatory and sure. Maybe it's a way to put a nail through the growth of tax havens. Shifting back to a more stakeholder model of how we run our companies, not just pure shareholder value and short-term profit. Thirdly, experimenting again with forms of industrial democracy and worker rights and how that can be done. And indeed, forms of worker share ownership in the future. There may be a time when there may need to be agreements on deferred wages in the short term, but they could go into worker savings in the future, which will give some control over companies. And finally, well, not finally, but picking up the responsibilities of multinationals and supply chains and building a different model into supply chains in the future, which Sharon alluded to in her first intervention. And lastly, trying to move, and maybe this is also more relevant for Iceland, to strong research between the public and the private sector with agreements between the companies and state in terms of support for research, but also dissemination of views and coordination in that area. So those would be just some things I'd be saying which would be interesting to look at in the future.
Thank you. I will now take all the remaining questions and give you an opportunity to reflect on and answer on those, because we are running out of time. We have one question here from our colleague in the entertainment and atypical business, the IT, which is of course hit very hard because they have a lot of members working in the tourism sector, conferences, theaters, etc. If you could give us some example of measures from some country that are supporting especially the atypical workforce. You mentioned it a bit, John, about gig economy. Benjamin Julian says, how do we start implementing free and open public amenities to reduce the resource intensity of our society? And how does that interact or conflict with the wage-led recovery model? One question here from Stefan Olafsson. To John, you mentioned the high reliance on tourism. Well, you can read the question, but I would give the floor now to Viðar. He has a question. Gjör svo vel, Viðar. Halla, could you unmute?
Thank you.
Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hi. Very nice to meet you. My name is Viðar Þorsteinsson. I'm the managing director of Efling Union, which is the union of blue-collar workers in the capital area and surrounding areas. Special thanks to you, Sharan, for your message of solidarity with us when we were in our struggle with the city of Reykjavik municipality earlier this year, which was greatly appreciated. In response to many of your ideas, I mean, I think it's fascinating to see how many smart ideas we can, put on the table. And to me, it seems that there is no lack of great ideas that the labor movement can put forth for how to not only respond to this crisis and do harm reduction and all of that, but even to make more long-term gains and victories for us. But then, for me, the question that sort of troubles me is that in times of recession, and especially in times of high unemployment, the bargaining position of unions and their general strength and influence is often weakened. And so, for example, in the public discourse in Iceland right now, and also coming from the special interests and lobbyists, we are seeing, proposals, for example, that we should give up our already negotiated wage increases that are supposed to happen later this year. And we are also, looking at messages that are telling us that, our strike rights should be reduced. Efling, actually, our union is in a position of being in a struggle with the municipalities, smaller municipalities around Reykjavik. We are currently having a strike vote. And the message that we get is, now is not the time for this, right? It's not the time for you to go on strike at this time. And so, my question to you is, what can unions do to maintain their strength and their bargaining position in times such as these, and not get dragged down too much into a defensive mode? Because this seems essential to me if we are ever going to be able to get started, not just on harm reduction, but to move forward and actually see these things as opportunities for us. So that's my question, and thank you both, Sharan and John, and the question is equally to both of you, I guess.
Thank you.
Why don't you start, John?
Okay. Thank you, Viðar. I would now give you, the closing remarks and responses, because I know your time is valuable, and we are running. We want to cut this short and be finished before 10:30 at least. So I don't know if you got the question from Stefán Ólafsson as well, John, if you read it.
Yes, yeah, sure. I'll do a very quick reply.
Very good. So you can reflect on that as well. I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Sharan, give the overall finish. Yeah, I mean, on the last question, I mean, I think there's a difference between the emergency measures in the short term, where obviously we're in a very abnormal situation, and really, where we'll be in the latter part of the year, where clearly wages do have to be part of the agreement. So I think it's important to make that distinction for the future. I mean, the short term, just production is shut down in many countries. I know less so in Iceland, but the question is how to try and keep people's income there, and that has to be part of the wage policy and the government policy and the social safety net. In the longer term, the question is to ensure the sufficient demand in the economy to pick up, and wages are obviously a key part of that. On the question about tourism, I mean, I think, looking at the figures from last year, I mean, there are, I think, double more visitors in Iceland per head of population than any other OECD, the nearest OECD country, which was Sweden, I think. So obviously a very high dependence on tourism. I'm not suggesting in a way that just has to be removed, but I think thinking through what is the strategy for that sector in the future. more about what does tourism look like. I think in the medium term, at least, there's obviously going to be much less air travel, much less collective travel, and focusing on the opportunities in Iceland for continuing tourism, using and people enjoying the natural sources in a way which is safe in the shorter term. So I think there's opportunities as well as risks. I think it would be wrong to just say, well, this is a good way to stop immigration. I'm not of the opinion of President Trump that it's too easy to be a scapegoat, and it pushes issues back into other countries where ascending countries are coming from. So getting a balanced employment in the future, seems to be clear. But again, I just totally agree. I mean, what I was trying to say, I think perhaps our crucial concern at the moment is to make sure, as the last speaker said, not being defensive and trying to see. I think there's an opportunity to see the central role of unions in societies, and the fact you need strong social partnership at the moment, of which Iceland is perhaps one of the leading examples, to pull through in the future, and that has to be a key part of the future message. But thanks very much for the opportunity to talk and to listen to you, and look forward to staying in touch as we move through the next few months.
Okay, so thank you, Drífa. I think on the substance of the question about what's the balance between the public and private sector, if I got it right, there's no doubt globally, at least, and you'd have to make that judgment in your own country, the balance has shifted way too far to the private sector. Now, that doesn't mean we can afford to, or we would necessarily want to nationalise everything. But we do have to look to the regulatory environment and the conditionality for support. It strikes me that, and I've accused several business leaders of this half jokingly, they want funding to prop up their businesses. They want the state to look after the wages. And I say, well, that's socialism, guys. Is that what you want? Because probably you've got partners here you can talk to. And they all say, oh, no. But in fact, they are socialising their losses because their business models have been appalling. You talked about the gig economy. I mean, we have 60% of the global workforce is working informally. The gig economy, the platform business we call, is part of that because there's no social license to operate. They've been allowed to exist outside the normal employment relationship, and that must end. But it must end with a bit of flexibility because we can't, John's right, people will make choices. And if we want to cover everybody, we can't say you're a direct worker who goes to work here or does this part-time or whatever. But the labour protection floor that the ILO Centenary Declaration put under that, along with social protection, gives us the answers as a base for a new social contract. So we have to think what it is in each economy that gets the balance right. But if you take health, and again, I'm talking globally, I wrote a blog about this a few weeks ago, because this is a health crisis that exposes not just, as I said earlier, the inequality, the massive lack of resilience in our economy, but it exposes the disasters of the reduction in health funding. And of course, I also wrote a piece about women and the fact that 70% of women are health workers, and they are in fact amongst, with the other essential services or frontline workers we've seen, the lowest paid. Now, that has to change. But in terms of funding public health, or what we call universal access to public health, because I don't want to get caught up in definitions, we have to have public health principles, and the foundation principle is that it has to be quality provision that's universally accessible for free to workers, obviously, who can't afford it depending on your model. So we have a lot of thinking to do, but I agree with you. We can put forward the ideas. We understand our economy. We're not alone in that. We need to talk to business because, they have a say in their future as well as our government partners. So tripartite dialogue is critical, but let's lift the veil. Let's make them be honest about the resilience of their business model. Let's put the conditionality in that says no more tax havens, no more share buybacks that leave you unable to pay workers wages for potentially 3 months. No more hiding behind government subsidies with no conditionality and all the rest of the things that Dreef has talked about. And let's get back to a shared prosperity. So finishing on wage-led growth, let's get back to a model where we say, and we're going to share prosperity. We don't want an economy that is actually driven by the elites or the 1% in their own interest as their greed has taken over and dominated the world. We want a regulated environment where everyone shares prosperity. And we know that the Nordic model, above all else, has done just that. Because you've built strong systems of social protection, because they mightn't be perfect, but you've built strong systems of social dialogue, then you've shared your wealth to the point where you can keep building it. And that's exactly what you did in terms of design coming out of 2008-9. So let's work with you, but in turn, I'm asking you to let us learn from your thoughts as well. So I'd really appreciate, just to have a sense of what people are thinking about Dreef, a copy of any of the questions. I can't promise to answer them all at the moment because of time, but I can put them in my head so I know what workers and trade union leaders are thinking. So thank you very much, and all strength, your arm, and ahead of May Day, solidarity.